The 1990s, they were a weird time for design. Baggy shorts, oversized t-shirts, lots of colors, really funky and cool looking cell phones, dial-up modems. And the watch world, fair to say it was one of the most experimental periods that most of us here, me included, can remember. For many brands, it seems like it was a time when they were trying to entice younger generations, a younger audience into the watch space. That is quite a common theme, even today. It's always about bringing in a newer generation. Quartz movements was still a popular choice, but mechanical watches were starting to show their heads more proudly again. Now, there are so many examples of watches today that we can all unanimously nod our heads and say, yep, this was a product of the 90s. And I would argue, this is going to be quite a contentious point, not many things, or very few things, watches included, from that period, they lack a timeless quality. Some have a bit too much funk in them, you know? And even the designs of the icons of the period. Let's make no mistake, there were some very good ones dotted in there. But an example like the Patek Philippe Aquanaut, one of the pieces that truly defined the 1990s, also inadvertently created by a brand like Patek Philippe to entice a younger audience. The grenade-style dial, the rubber strap, even the 35mm case design, it speaks to the 1990s in a lot of ways. What about the Audemars Piguet Offshore, another watch that does scream 90s transitioning into the 2000s, and being more on brand, a watch like the Seamaster Professional. I mean, this watch screams the 90s more than any other. Now, as we all know, some watches here, they have dated, they have lost their appeal far faster than others. Some designs out there, we wish, if it wasn't for hype and demand and all the interest created by media and all the rest, we wish that some of these watches could find a grave for themselves by now. But getting back on topic, referring to Omega again, their entire lifespan, from the late 60s all the way through the 90s, they created some oddly interesting designs. Off the top of my head, a watch like the Ploprof, a piece that very much defined the 1970s with its angular case. Character, charm, ugliness, it had it all. What about the lesser known, lesser appreciated Caliber 321 Seamaster? Only those with an eagle eye for detail knows that this is the legendary movement inside a watch that's more casual, more dress-oriented. And one of the models I have always secretly admired for the creativity, for just the boldness of its design, is the Genève Admiralty. From its accent colors to the plots on the dial, the choices of orange very often, the crown guards. What about a great reference linking to the watches we're talking about today, like the 5203? I adore the simplicity and the design of this watch. There's so much to like about these watches that are lesser known, that are lesser appreciated. Now, wouldn't you know, there is some structure to this video, because that leads very neatly on to the dynamic collection. This range has always fascinated me. Between the 1970s and the 1990s, they created three very distinct models. And what's even more fascinating when we look back at it now in hindsight, is that each one of these watches very much signify the time periods when they were made. You don't need a roadmap, you don't need any of my assistance to know that this one is from the 80s, this one is from the 70s. And that is quite rare for a brand that is ever adapting, ever changing, to create pieces that are so distinct and defined by the decade that they were made in. You know, we started the piece from the 1970s, and it's true what everyone says, that the level of creativity around this period of time was off the charts. Modern, retro, futurism, these watches had it all. UFO-styled case. Integrated bracelets, which were all the craze. And these stunning racing-style dials, sun-brushed effects, and so many hidden details. By the time we move to the Dynamic 2 in the 1980s, you can start seeing a bit of the constellation, sort of yuppie culture that's beginning to show itself. A watch that has a bit of Wall Street injected in there, but even still, brushed dials, color accents. And then we arrive in the 1990s, the late 90s, and we are given the Dynamic 3, the last of its kind, arguably the most recognized watch of this collection. Now, what has governed the reputation of this watch and has given it a cult classic status, I think it's fair to say. What has made the Dynamic last so long and continue to last is the fact that it represented Omega at a very particular time. A time where COSC certification, METAS certification, in-house manufacture, these things didn't really matter. Simply put, they were rugged, reliable, dependable, they had a charm about them, and they were relatively affordable. Now, if I haven't made it clear by now, sharing photos and videos of the 1990s as a time period and the watches that came out of it, there was really no clear direction about where watches were going, the themes that they were adopting at all. We could say that the reissue motif was starting to be experimented with here. Was it a period of time, especially with watches that didn't have its own truly defined or rationalized identity? Maybe. Touching on cult classics again, you know the one watch that comes to mind when I look at the Dynamic 3, and that is the Tudor North Flag. Maybe it's to do with the fact that they all have matte black dials, Arabic numerals on their dials, or that they have yellow accents. I don't know what it is, but on a deeper level, it is that cult status, that reputation that as collectors, we have associated with them. Now, what makes the Dynamic 3 an odd, interesting design for someone like me is that it doesn't get everything right. It is most definitely a piece of the 1990s, and it shows everywhere. And I think the best words you could use to describe them is that they are stylized. Where the Dynamic 1 and the Dynamic 2 were very much products of their time, the Dynamic 3 is starting to pull inspiration from pilot watches and field watches from the 1940s. You could say a lot of its design inspiration stems from a watch like the Dirty Dozen field watch, maybe a model more directly linked to the RAF of the 1940s and the 1950s. The chronograph, on the other hand, you could say this watch is an officer's chronograph. The only thing it's missing is a telemeter scale. From the bold and very stylized Breguet-inspired numerals, to the railroad track around the dial, even the hash marks on the 30-minute counter on the chronograph, they were not trying to hide the fact that these were 40s-inspired watches, but then went a step further by adding the yellow accent colors to bring it into the 90s frame. When I look to the chronograph especially, I see Breitling Premier Navitimer details. A watch that also originated around that time with a strong classic look. And then a more modern, a more direct inspiration, you see elements belonging to the Longines Navigation Big Eye. Funny enough that both of these watches use a modular column wheel chronograph movement, but the dynamic chronograph, a watch that's nearly 30 years old, stands at 38mm in diameter and is under 13mm thick. I think the reason why the Dynamic 3 is so revered and appreciated is it is still relatively affordable today for what you're getting, yes, is the fact that the tritium on the dial has actually aged. It's not faux, it's legitimate. But more than that, it is the boldness of a design like this. You see, the thing is, success with watch design today has come at a cost. In the 1990s, with no clear inspiration, no clear direction of where these brands were going, trying their utmost to bring people in, they could be a lot more creative. The issue with modern watch design today is, yes, we can instantly recognize the brands and the watches they represent, but the styles of watches we are seeing, they are far more formulaic. And pieces like the Dynamic, if they were reintroduced with this sort of format and style, they probably wouldn't fly today. Now, where I would agree, the Dynamic 3 does go a bit heavy in a few places. I admire the fact that all of these watches, they do in one way or another live up to the name that is printed on the dial. And on a more sobering note, when the Dynamic name ended, when this collection disappeared, we could say that the dynamism that was represented by a watch like this also disappeared from Omega's catalogue. Clear as day now, we see that the majority of the watches that they produce belong either to the Seamaster, the Speedmaster, possibly the Constellation line. That's about it. But saying all of that, the cult watch, the cult classic like the Dynamic, it does live on. And to this day, it remains as one of the most fascinating neo-vintage case studies around, especially when we refer back to the late 90s. Now, like I said at the beginning of the video, what has made the Dynamic such a great collection to study and to follow is the fact that each one of these individual watches represent the period of time when they were made, the 70s, the 80s, and the 90s. And we just don't see that anymore because, I mean, how do you best define the 2020s in one watch? Is it even possible? And as a bonus remark, if you are like me, would you prefer to see yellow accent colors used on watch dials again? I think it's one accent color combination that is truly lacking, but there we go. So have you ever owned one? Has the Dynamic ever appealed to you? Do you agree that there is a level of creativity that is missing with some watches and the brands today? That formulaic design is what sells and it's what the names are sticking with. Thank you for taking the time to watch this video. See you in the next one.